On my mother-in-law's 62nd birthday, exactly 47 minutes after I arrived, she handed me a silver serving tray and told me to start clearing plates while the other guests were still eating. 10 minutes later, she removed the only empty chair at the table and said, loud enough for all 28 guests to hear, "Helpers don't sit with family." If you've ever been humiliated so quietly that no one else called it abuse, you already know how that moment feels. And before we go further, tell me in the comments, what would you have done if someone treated you like that in front of a room full of people? Would you walk out or stay long enough to see what they were really planning? Because I didn't leave, not that night. My name is Elena Marquez. I was 29 years old at the time, living in Austin, Texas, working 12-hour overnight shifts, cleaning surgical suites at St. David's Medical Center. It wasn't glamorous work. It meant bleach burns on my hands and the smell of antiseptic clinging to my hair, no matter how much I washed it. But it was honest work, and more importantly, it paid enough for me to quietly support someone who never told anyone I existed. My husband, Daniel Whitmore, never introduced me as Elena, my wife. Not in public. Not around his family. To them, I was always that girl Daniel married too fast, or, as his mother liked to say, temporary. The birthday party was held at her house in Westlake Hills, a 4,200 square foot property sitting on land worth about $1.8 million. I knew the numbers because I'd spent many nights looking them up, trying to understand exactly why money mattered more to that family than people did. When I arrived that evening, I was carrying a wrapped gift, a vintage pearl brooch I'd spent $340 on. That was 2 extra overtime shifts. I remember rehearsing in my car before walking in. Just smile. Stay polite. Don't react. Because Daniel had warned me the night before, his voice low and tense. Mom's still upset about, just keep a low profile. He never said what she was upset about. He didn't have to. It was always the same thing. I wasn't from their world. When I stepped inside, I counted immediately 28 guests, including 2 state senators, 1 real estate developer, and 3 of Daniel's cousins who ran the family's construction business. There were place cards at the long dining table, 27 of them, not 28. I noticed that detail instantly. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, holding my gift, waiting. Daniel avoided my eyes. His mother, Margaret Whitmore, smiled when she saw me. That tight, polished smile that never reached her eyes. "Oh, good," she said, clapping her hands once. "You're here. We were just about to serve." Then she pressed the silver tray into my hands, and everything shifted. At first, I thought she was joking. I actually laughed softly and said, "Where should I sit after I help?" She didn't laugh back. She leaned close enough for me to smell her expensive perfume. Something sharp and floral. "You don't sit," she said calmly. "You contribute." Then she turned away and raised her voice. "Elena's helping tonight since she doesn't have much experience hosting formal events." A few people chuckled politely. Daniel said nothing. That silence was louder than anything she could have said. For the next 47 minutes, I moved around the room, collecting plates, refilling wine glasses, and carrying dishes back to the kitchen. No one stopped me. No one said, "You don't need to do that." They just accepted it. Like this was exactly where I belonged. I remember one moment very clearly. Daniel's cousin Rachel leaned toward another guest and whispered, not quietly enough, "Is she staff?" And the other woman replied, "Probably. Daniel always dates charity cases." I didn't react. I kept moving, because something inside me had already started calculating, watching, noticing details. Like the fact that Margaret kept glancing toward the hallway office every time someone mentioned estate planning, or how Daniel refused to meet my eyes when guests asked about the new trust restructuring. I didn't know what it meant yet. But I knew one thing for certain. This humiliation wasn't random. It was preparation. After dessert was served, I finally set the tray down and walked toward the dining table. There was still 1 empty chair at the far end. For a moment, I thought maybe she'd allow me to sit now. Margaret saw me approaching. Without breaking her conversation, she stood up, lifted the chair, and carried it out of the room. The scraping sound against the hardwood floor echoed like something deliberate. Then she returned, sat down, and said calmly, "Some people need to understand their place before they're allowed at the table." No one spoke. 27 pairs of eyes watched me standing there. That's when I asked my first question of the night. Not to her. To Daniel. Do you agree with her? He hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said quietly, Elena, just don't make a scene. That was the moment something inside me went completely still. Cold. Because humiliation is one thing, but betrayal is silence. I nodded. I smiled. And I walked back into the kitchen without another word. No one noticed when I pulled my phone out. No one saw me open the email that had arrived earlier that afternoon. The one I hadn't had time to read yet because I'd rushed straight from a double shift to this party. The subject line read, Final Notice, Beneficiary Disclosure Request. And the sender's name was a law firm in downtown Austin I had never contacted in my life. I stared at the number inside the email for a long time. $2,750,000. That was the exact moment I realized something none of them knew yet. I wasn't the one being pushed out of the family. I was the one they were trying to erase. And the real question wasn't why Margaret Whitmore humiliated me in front of 28 people. The real question was this. How did my name end up connected to a multi-million-dollar trust her family thought only they controlled? And why had Daniel never told me it existed at all? At 2:13 a.m. that same night, after washing 186 surgical instruments under fluorescent hospital lights, I finally opened the attachment from the law firm and saw my full legal name listed under a trust account valued at $2,750,000. 7 minutes later, I realized something even colder. The trust had been created 8 years earlier, when I was still a college sophomore who barely had $312 in my checking account. If you've ever discovered a secret about your life that makes you question every relationship you've ever trusted, you know the exact kind of silence that follows. Tell me honestly in the comments, would you confront your spouse immediately or pretend you knew nothing until you understood the whole truth? Because I chose silence, and that decision would change everything. The law firm was called Harland & Pierce Estate Management, located on the 17th floor of a glass building on Congress Avenue in downtown Austin. I'd passed it hundreds of times on the bus without ever imagining my life would intersect with theirs. The email itself was formal, almost sterile. Ms. Elena Sofia Marquez, it began, using my full legal name, a name Daniel's family never even bothered to remember correctly. It stated that I had been identified as a primary contingent beneficiary of something called the Whitmore Legacy Family Trust. The document attached was 42 pages long. I read it 3 times that night in the hospital break room, the hum of vending machines buzzing around me while my coffee went cold. Each time, the same sentence felt heavier. Primary contingent beneficiary, not secondary, not distant, primary, which meant one simple thing in legal terms. If the current designated heir was removed by death, disqualification, or legal disinheritance, the assets transferred directly to me. That current heir was listed on page 2. Daniel Robert Whitmore, my husband. My hands didn't shake when I read it. That's what scared me most. Because instead of panic, I felt clarity. The kind that comes when a puzzle piece clicks into place. Suddenly, Margaret's hostility over the years made sense. Her comments about me being temporary. Her constant insistence that Daniel signed prenuptial agreements, 3 different versions before we married. Her refusal to acknowledge me publicly. She wasn't just looking down on me, she was protecting something. I scrolled further into the document and saw the date the trust had been amended most recently, 4 months ago. The same month, Margaret had suddenly started insisting that Daniel and I attend family financial planning dinners. The same month, Daniel had become strangely distant, working late, guarding his phone, avoiding conversations about our future. At the time, I thought it was stress. Now I saw something else. Preparation. The trust amendment included a clause titled Beneficiary Contingency Conditions. I read it slowly, carefully, because legal language hides its intentions in plain sight. The clause stated that if Daniel Whitmore were deemed unfit to manage the trust due to actions causing financial or reputational harm to the Whitmore family, his beneficiary status would be automatically revoked, and upon revocation, the trust would transfer to the contingent beneficiary, me. I leaned back in the plastic break room chair and stared at the ceiling tiles. One thought echoed clearly. They weren't trying to push me out of the family. They were trying to control when and how I would receive something they couldn't legally remove me from, which raised a terrifying possibility. Had they known about this trust all along? Or worse, had they planned something involving Daniel to trigger that clause? Because one thing stood out immediately. There was no mention anywhere in the document that I had been notified when the trust was created. Legally, I should have been informed years ago. But I hadn't been. Someone had delayed disclosure. Someone with legal authority. Someone inside the family. I looked at the bottom of the last page. Trust Administrator, Margaret Louise Whitmore. That was the moment my chest tightened for the first time, because it meant she had known my name was on that document for years. She knew I was tied to their fortune, and yet she treated me like disposable help. Why? I didn't have to guess long, because another line answered that question. Contingent beneficiary status becomes void if beneficiary is legally separated or divorced from primary heir prior to activation of clause. I read that sentence twice, then the third time, and everything snapped into focus. If Daniel divorced me before losing his beneficiary status, I would receive nothing. Zero. The trust would revert to secondary heirs, his cousins, who ran the construction business. The same cousins who had smirked while I served them wine that night. The humiliation suddenly felt strategic, deliberate, not just cruelty, pressure, a message. Leave on your own. Before we force you out. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Daniel, sent at 2:31 a.m. Hey, Mom says you left early. You okay? I stared at the screen for a long moment, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I realized something else in that instant. He wasn't asking because he cared. He was checking whether I suspected anything. I typed back slowly. Just tired. Long shift tomorrow. He replied almost immediately. Good. Get some rest. Love you. Love you. 2 words that suddenly felt like paperwork. That was when I decided something important. I wouldn't confront him. Not yet, because if Margaret Whitmore had spent 8 years controlling information about that trust, then the real truth wasn't in the documents. It was in what they were hiding right now. And I needed to know one thing before making any move. Did Daniel know I was listed as the contingent beneficiary? Or was he just another piece in his mother's game? I closed the email, locked my phone, and returned to work. At 3:02 a.m., while I was disinfecting an operating room floor, a thought came to me so cold it felt almost calm. Revenge isn't loud, it's patient. Because for the first time since marrying into the Whitmore family, I understood something clearly. They believed I was powerless, replaceable, easy to erase. And that assumption was about to become their biggest mistake. But what I didn't know, yet what I would discover just 36 hours later, was that someone else inside that family had already started moving against Daniel. Someone who didn't just want to push me out. Someone who was preparing to destroy him completely. 36 hours after I read the trust documents, at exactly 6:48 p.m. on a Tuesday, I overheard my husband whisper the words, "After the divorce is finalized, the clause won't matter anymore," while standing in our own kitchen. And 2 seconds later, I heard his mother reply through the phone speaker, calm and precise. "Just make sure she signs voluntarily. Courts don't question paperwork people agree to." If you've ever realized that someone you loved has been planning your exit from their life like a business transaction, you know how quiet the world suddenly feels. Let me ask you this. Would you confront them in that moment? Or stay silent long enough to hear everything they thought you'd never know? Because I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stood just outside the kitchen doorway, holding a grocery bag with exactly $73.42 worth of food inside, and listened. Daniel didn't know I had come home early. He thought I was still at work. "Mom," he said in a low voice, "she's not stupid. She's been asking questions lately." Margaret Whitmore's voice remained cool, almost bored. "Of course she has. People always sense when they're about to lose something. That doesn't mean they can stop it. Lose something. Not someone, something." Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "I just don't want this getting messy." "It won't," she said. "Once she signs the separation agreement, the trust automatically updates. You'll retain full control. End of story." My fingers tightened around the plastic bag until it crinkled loudly. Inside, a jar of pasta sauce shifted and nearly slipped out. I froze. For a split second, I thought they'd heard me, but Daniel just exhaled sharply. She still thinks we're working through things, he muttered. Margaret's response came immediately. That's because you've let her believe she's your wife. Stop acting guilty. This is business, Daniel. Business. That word echoed in my mind like a verdict. In that moment, something inside me finally understood the full shape of the betrayal. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't personal. It was strategic, calculated. 8 years of silence about the trust, 4 months of cold distance. And now, a carefully planned divorce, designed to trigger a legal loophole that would erase me from a $2.75 million inheritance. I stepped back silently into the hallway before they could notice me. My heart wasn't racing. It wasn't breaking. It was steady. Because clarity has a strange effect. It removes hope. And without hope, there's no hesitation left. I walked quietly into the bedroom and set the groceries down on the dresser. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. Memories came back in fragments. Daniel proposing in a cheap restaurant when we were both struggling, promising we'd build a life together, saying money didn't matter. And suddenly, I saw those moments differently, not as lies, but as calculations that changed once he learned about the trust. Because one detail now stood out clearly. The trust had been amended 4 months ago. The same month, Daniel suddenly started insisting we keep our finances separate. The same month, he stopped talking about buying a house together. The same month, he suggested we take a break from trying to have children. At the time, I thought it was stress. Now, I knew. He wasn't preparing for a future with me. He was preparing for a future without me. Footsteps approached down the hallway. I quickly wiped my face, though I hadn't realized tears had started falling. Daniel walked into the bedroom 2 minutes later. He stopped when he saw me. Surprise flashed across his face for a fraction of a second before he forced a smile. "You're home early," I nodded. Shift got canceled. He studied me carefully, like he was checking for signs. Suspicion. Knowledge. Threat. "What's wrong?" he asked. I held his gaze steadily. Nothing in my expression betrayed what I'd just heard. "Nothing," I said quietly, "just tired." He relaxed slightly. That small exhale told me everything. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about exposure. He walked closer and sat beside me on the bed. "We should talk soon," he said gently, "about where things are going." I already knew what he meant. The separation agreement was coming, and he wanted me unprepared, emotional. Cooperative. I asked one question, calmly. "Are you unhappy with me?" He hesitated just long enough to confirm the truth. "It's complicated," he said. Then he added the sentence that would stay with me forever. "You deserve someone who can give you more stability. Not love, not honesty. Stability." In his world, that word meant money, security, control. I nodded slowly, as if I believed him, as if I accepted the narrative he was about to build. Inside, something hardened completely, because at that moment, I understood the second layer of truth. Not just that they planned to divorce me, but that they believed I would accept it quietly, without fighting, without asking questions, without realizing the legal consequences hidden inside the paperwork. And that assumption would become their fatal mistake. Daniel squeezed my hand gently. "We'll figure things out," he said. I smiled faintly. "Yes," I replied. "We will." Later that night, after he fell asleep, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind wasn't replaying the betrayal. It was calculating options, legal timelines, financial consequences, strategic risks, because one thing was certain now. Margaret Whitmore wasn't just trying to humiliate me. She was orchestrating a controlled removal, a quiet erasure designed to protect a fortune. But there was one problem she hadn't anticipated. She believed she controlled all the information. She believed I didn't understand the legal structure of that trust. And most importantly, she believed I didn't have allies. What she didn't know yet, what neither she nor Daniel suspected, was that someone inside their own circle had already reached out to me. Someone who had access to documents they thought were locked away. Someone who had been watching their plan unfold from the inside. I didn't know their identity yet, only the message they had sent earlier that evening. 3 words and a time. Thursday, noon, alone. And beneath it, one chilling sentence. "You're not the only one they're trying to erase." 2 days later, at exactly 11:59 a.m. on Thursday, I walked into a downtown Austin cafe, carrying a plain manila envelope that contained copies of my marriage certificate, my ID, and the first 3 pages of the Whitmore Trust documents. At 12:02 p.m., a woman I had seen only once before in my life sat across from me and quietly said, "If you sign their separation agreement, you'll lose about $2.7 million. And they know you don't realize how close you are to triggering the clause." If you've ever discovered that someone inside your enemy's circle has been watching everything silently, you know the kind of tension that fills the air. Tell me honestly, would you trust someone who approached you with secrets about your own life? Or would you assume they were part of the trap? Because I didn't answer her immediately. I studied her first. Her name was Claire Whitmore Hastings, Daniel's cousin, 37 years old, corporate attorney, and most importantly, the only member of the Whitmore family who had never openly insulted me. We had spoken exactly twice before, once at our wedding, once at a family Christmas dinner 2 years earlier. Both times she had barely said more than polite greetings, which made her presence now impossible to ignore. She slid a black folder across the table toward me. Her voice remained low and calm. "You should open this before you decide whether to trust me." I hesitated for 1 second, then opened it. Inside were photocopies of legal filings documents, stamped with county records from Travis County Probate Court. At the top of the first page was a title that made my stomach drop: Petition for Emergency Trust Review. Files, 5 weeks ago. Petitioner, Margaret Louise Whitmore. Respondent, Daniel Robert Whitmore. I looked up slowly. "What is this?" I asked. Claire held my gaze evenly. "It's the second layer of what they're hiding from you." My pulse quickened for the first time since this entire nightmare began, because that meant something critical. There was more, a lot more. I flipped through the pages carefully. Legal language filled the documents, but one paragraph stood out immediately. It stated that Margaret Whitmore had formally petitioned the court to review Daniel's fitness as the primary beneficiary of the family trust. The reason listed was vague, but chilling. Evidence of behavior posing financial and reputational risk to trust assets. I read the line twice, then again, because the implication was unmistakable. Margaret wasn't just trying to remove me from the trust. She was preparing to remove Daniel, too. I looked back at Claire. "You're telling me she's trying to disinherit her own son?" Claire didn't blink. "Yes." A heavy silence settled between us. The sounds of the cafe espresso machines, quiet conversations, clinking cups, felt distant, unreal. "Why?" I asked quietly. Claire leaned back slightly. "Because the trust isn't just about money. It's about control." She paused before continuing. "And Daniel lost her trust months ago." That statement shifted something in my mind. Because until that moment, I had assumed Daniel and Margaret were fully aligned. But this revealed a deeper fracture. A conflict inside the family itself. Claire tapped one of the pages with her finger. "Look at the timeline." I followed her gesture. The petition had been filed exactly 5 weeks earlier, which meant one thing. Margaret had started legal proceedings against her own son before she began pressuring him to divorce me. That changed everything. "Why would she want him divorced first?" I asked slowly. Claire's expression hardened. "Because if Daniel loses beneficiary status while still married to you, you become the primary owner of the entire trust." The words landed like a quiet explosion. "So she needs the divorce finalized first," I said. "Yes." Claire's voice remained precise. "Otherwise, she loses control of the assets permanently." I sat back in my chair, absorbing the full scope of the strategy. Margaret's plan suddenly became clear, in terrifying detail. Step 1. Pressure Daniel to divorce me quickly. Step 2. Once I'm legally removed, proceed with disqualifying Daniel from the trust. Step 3. Transfer control to the secondary heirs, Margaret's nephews. All perfectly legal, all carefully timed, all designed to leave me with nothing. And Daniel with nothing, except Margaret would still control everything as administrator. A perfect consolidation of power. I looked at Claire again. "Why are you telling me this?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag and placed a small flash drive on the table between us. "Because Daniel doesn't know what's really happening either." My eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean? Her voice dropped lower. Margaret isn't just preparing to remove him from the trust. She paused. She's building a case that could destroy his reputation completely. A cold tension settled in my chest. What kind of case? I asked. Claire held my gaze. Financial misconduct. The words felt heavy, unavoidable. I leaned forward slightly. Did he do something illegal? Claire didn't answer directly. Instead, she said something that chilled me more than any accusation could. I don't know yet, but I do know this. She's been collecting evidence for months. She pushed the flash drive closer to me. That contains copies of internal financial reports from Whitmore Construction Group. I stared at it, not touching it yet. Why give this to me? I asked quietly. Claire's expression softened slightly for the first time. Because you're the only person in this situation who has nothing to gain by destroying someone unfairly. She paused. And because you're the only one who can stop what's coming. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy, unfinished, because I understood immediately what she meant. If Margaret succeeded, Daniel would lose everything. His inheritance, his career, his reputation. And I would still walk away with nothing. But if I intervened strategically, the outcome could shift entirely. I looked down at the flash drive again, then back at Claire. You're asking me to protect him? I asked. She shook her head slowly. No. Her voice was steady. I'm asking you to protect yourself. That distinction mattered, because revenge isn't always about destroying someone. Sometimes it's about refusing to be erased. I reached forward and finally picked up the flash drive. Its weight felt insignificant in my hand, but I knew it contained something powerful, something dangerous, something capable of changing the entire balance of power inside the Whitmore family. As I slipped it into my purse, Claire added one final sentence. Quiet. Measured. And deeply unsettling. There's one more thing you need to know. I looked at her. What? She held my gaze steadily. Margaret's evidence against Daniel includes transactions tied to an account opened under your name. The words froze the air around me because that meant one terrifying possibility. Somewhere inside this war for control, someone had already started setting me up as the fall person, and I had no idea how deep that trap went yet. At 9:17 p.m. that same night, I plugged the flash drive into my laptop and saw a list of 43 financial transactions totaling $612,480, all routed through an account opened under my full legal name. 3 seconds later, I realized something even colder. I had never opened that account. If you've ever discovered your identity being used in a financial scheme you didn't even know existed, you know the exact kind of dread that settles into your bones. Let me ask you this. Would you go straight to the police? Or would you first try to understand who set you up and why? Because I didn't call anyone. Not yet. I needed to see everything first. The files inside the flash drive were organized with the kind of precision only a corporate attorney would use. Claire hadn't exaggerated. There were spreadsheets, bank statements, internal audit notes, and email threads from Whitmore Construction Group's finance department. I opened the first document. It was a ledger report covering the last 6 months. Every line listed the same receiving account holder name, Elena Sofia Marquez. My name, my social security number, my date of birth. Everything matched perfectly, except one detail. The account was opened at a regional bank in San Antonio, a city I had not visited in over 4 years. The opening date was listed clearly, 4 months ago. The exact same month the trust had been amended. The exact same month Daniel started talking about separating our finances. My chest tightened, because that wasn't coincidence. That was orchestration. I scrolled down the ledger slowly. Each transaction was labeled as consulting payments from Whitmore Construction Group. Amounts varied: $9,800, $12,400, $7,200. All carefully kept below $15,000 thresholds that would trigger automatic federal reporting flags. Someone knew exactly how to avoid scrutiny. Someone experienced, someone strategic, and someone inside the company. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was Daniel. A text. Hey, can we talk tonight? Mom wants us to meet with the family lawyer tomorrow morning. I stared at the message. Tomorrow morning. That timing wasn't random. It meant the separation agreement was ready. They were moving quickly, faster than I expected. I didn't respond yet. Instead, I opened another file from the flash drive. This one was labeled Internal Risk Assessment. The first paragraph made my stomach drop. Preliminary review suggests potential embezzlement activity tied to account holder Elena S. Marquez. Estimated liability exposure, $600,000 plus. Liability exposure. That was legal language for one simple reality. Someone was preparing to accuse me of financial fraud. And not just informally, formally. With documentation, with evidence trails, with enough numbers to convince investigators. I felt my breathing slow, not quicken, because fear wasn't what I felt anymore. It was clarity. This was the third layer of Margaret's strategy. Not just removing me from the trust, not just disinheriting Daniel, but ensuring that when everything collapsed, I would be the one blamed, the one facing legal consequences, the perfect scapegoat. And the timing was flawless. If the divorce went through first, I would have no legal standing in the family, no access to internal records. No protection, just an account in my name, linked to hundreds of thousands of dollars. I closed my eyes for a moment. One thought settled firmly in my mind. Margaret Whitmore wasn't just ruthless, she was methodical, and she had been planning this for months, maybe longer. I opened the final folder on the flash drive. This one contained email exchanges. The first message was dated 3 months earlier, from Margaret Whitmore to Chief Financial Officer, Whitmore Construction Group. Subject, documentation timeline. The body of the email was short. Ensure all transfers appear consistent with contracted services. We will initiate formal review after legal separation is confirmed. I read that sentence twice. The meaning was unmistakable. They were waiting for the divorce before triggering the fraud accusation. Because once I was legally separated from Daniel, I would be easier to isolate, easier to prosecute, easier to destroy. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. This wasn't just a family conflict anymore. This was a legal trap, and I was standing at the center of it. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Daniel. Please don't ignore me. Tomorrow is important. Important. Yes, because tomorrow morning they expected me to walk into a lawyer's office, sign a separation agreement, and unknowingly step into a financial accusation that could ruin my life. I typed a reply slowly. Okay, I'll be there. I hit send. Then I turned back to my laptop and opened one last document Claire had included. It wasn't financial. It was legal. A draft of the separation agreement. My eyes scanned the clauses quickly. Property division. Asset waivers. Confidentiality terms. Then I reached the section that mattered most. Section 14. Mutual liability release. The clause stated that both parties agreed to waive claims against each other for financial disputes occurring prior to the date of separation. That single sentence carried devastating implications. If I signed it, I would lose the right to defend myself against any accusations tied to the fraudulent account. They could claim the transactions were my responsibility, and I would have already legally waived the ability to contest them. It was a perfect legal ambush. I closed the laptop slowly. The room felt very quiet, because now I understood something completely. This wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about inheritance. It was about power, control, and erasing me completely, financially, legally, socially. I stood up and walked to the window. Austin's city lights stretched across the night, calm, unbothered. For a long moment, I just watched. Then I asked myself the question I knew the audience would ask too. If you were in my position right now, would you walk away quietly and try to rebuild your life? Or would you stay, fight back, and risk everything to expose the truth? My answer came without hesitation. I wasn't leaving. Not yet. Because Margaret Whitmore believed she had already trapped me. She believed I would sign the papers. She believed I didn't understand the legal strategy. But she was wrong about one critical detail. She thought I was alone. What she didn't know yet, what she would discover very soon, was that Claire wasn't the only person inside her own circle who had started questioning her actions. There was another name buried deep inside those financial records. A name tied to transaction approvals. A name that appeared on every internal authorization form. And that name belonged to someone Margaret trusted completely. Her own chief financial officer. The same person scheduled to attend tomorrow morning's meeting. And according to the documents, he had already begun secretly copying files months before I ever knew any of this existed. At 10:03 a.m. the next morning, I sat across from Margaret Whitmore and a corporate attorney, while a 26-page separation agreement lay open in front of me, and she calmly slid a pen toward my hand, as if she were offering me a dessert menu. 2 minutes later, she said in a quiet, almost pleasant voice, "If you sign today, Elena, you can walk away cleanly with $50,000. Otherwise, things may become complicated." If you've ever had someone threaten you, politely with a smile instead of raised voices, you know how much more dangerous that feels. Tell me honestly in the comments, would you accept the money just to escape safely? Or would you sit there and pretend you didn't know it was a trap? Because I didn't reach for the pen. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. The meeting was held in a private conference room at Harlan and Pierce Estate Management, the same firm that had sent me the beneficiary disclosure email days earlier. That detail alone told me everything about the power dynamics in the room. Margaret controlled the lawyers. Margaret controlled the information. Margaret believed she controlled me. Daniel sat to my right, stiff and tense, his jaw tight like he hadn't slept. He hadn't looked directly at me once since we arrived. On Margaret's left sat a man in his early 50s, wearing a gray suit. Robert Langford, Chief Financial Officer of Whitmore Construction Group. I recognized his name instantly from the authorization signatures in the flash drive documents. He kept his eyes on the table, avoiding both me and Margaret. That avoidance was not accidental. It was fear. The attorney cleared his throat and began speaking in the polished, neutral tone of someone who delivered life-altering documents for a living. This agreement provides a mutually respectful separation. Mrs. Whitmore has agreed to offer financial support exceeding standard legal requirements. Margaret's lips curved slightly at the phrase, exceeding standard. She wanted me to hear that part clearly. To feel grateful, to feel small. The lawyer continued. In exchange, both parties waive future claims related to financial disputes, inheritance interests, and reputational damages. There it was, the legal trap hidden inside formal language. I nodded slowly, as if I were absorbing the terms for the first time. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "You don't need to overthink this, Elena," she said softly. "This is a generous offer." I met her gaze calmly. "Generous compared to what?" I asked. A brief silence followed. She hadn't expected a direct question. "Compared to litigation?" she replied smoothly. "Divorce court can be unpleasant." I held her gaze for another moment. Then I asked a second question, even quieter. "Or compared to being accused of financial misconduct?" The air in the room changed instantly. Daniel's head snapped toward me. The attorney stopped speaking mid-sentence, and Robert Langford finally looked up. Margaret did not react immediately, which told me something important. She was trained to control her expressions, but her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. That was enough. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said calmly. Her voice remained steady, polished, controlled. But I saw the calculation behind her eyes. She was assessing, measuring how much I knew. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "I'm referring to the consulting payments routed through an account opened under my name 4 months ago," I said. Silence. Heavy. Daniel's face drained of color. "What account?" he whispered. Margaret didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on me. "That sounds like a misunderstanding," she said. A classic first response. Denial. Exactly as expected. I nodded slowly. "Maybe," I said. Then I turned my gaze toward Robert Langford. "And maybe Mr. Langford can clarify." His reaction was immediate. He froze. His hands clasped tightly together, sweat visible at his temple. Margaret spoke sharply for the first time. "Robert, there is no need to discuss internal company matters here." That sentence revealed everything. Internal company matters. She had just confirmed the transactions were real. I watched Robert carefully. His breathing was shallow. And then he did something Margaret clearly hadn't anticipated. He spoke quietly. "Yes, there is." The room fell completely silent. He swallowed before continuing. "I requested an internal audit 2 months ago," he said, "because the transfers didn't match legitimate consulting contracts." "Daniel, you never told me about this," Daniel said. Robert shook his head. "I tried," he replied, "but your mother instructed me to delay reporting until after your legal separation." The words landed like a controlled explosion. Margaret's expression finally hardened. "Robert," she said sharply, "You are overstepping." But he didn't stop. He reached into his briefcase and placed a thick folder on the table. "I copied every authorization document," he said, "and every transfer request came directly from you." Silence. Total. Absolute. Daniel looked at his mother slowly, shock turning into something deeper, something darker. "You approved these payments?" he asked. Margaret didn't answer immediately, because now she had moved into the second stage of reaction. Blame shifting. "This was for asset protection," she said coolly. "If Daniel's behavior triggered legal scrutiny, the trust needed safeguards." Her eyes flicked toward me. "You were a convenient legal buffer." Convenient. Not innocent. Not unaware. Just useful. Daniel stood up abruptly. "You set her up?" he said. His voice shook. Margaret's expression remained cold. "I protected the family," she replied. "And I protected you." Daniel stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "You were going to let her take the fall for fraud," he said. She didn't deny it, because now she had entered the third stage. Justification. "Collateral damage is sometimes necessary," she said calmly. The words echoed through the room. Cold. Unapologetic. And final. I watched the entire exchange without speaking, because this moment wasn't about defending myself. It was about revealing the truth, layer by layer, exactly as it needed to unfold. I finally spoke quietly. "So the separation agreement isn't about ending a marriage," I said. "It's about isolating a scapegoat." No one argued. No one denied it. That silence was confirmation. Margaret leaned back in her chair. For the first time, her voice carried a hint of steel. "You still have a choice, Elena," she said. "You can sign today and walk away quietly." She paused. "Or you can fight this and discover how exhausting it is to challenge a family with resources." A threat. Clear. Direct. But I didn't feel afraid, because something had shifted in that room. Daniel's trust in her had cracked. Robert Langford had already stepped out of her control. And most importantly, she had revealed her strategy openly, which meant she believed she still held the advantage. She didn't know the most critical detail yet. I met her gaze calmly. "I won't be signing anything today," I said. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Then you're making a mistake," she replied. I shook my head. "No," I said quietly. "You already made it." Because Margaret Whitmore still believed this conflict was private, contained, manageable. What she didn't know yet, what would change everything, was that a formal probate court hearing had already been scheduled, one that would require public testimony, financial records, witness statements, and full disclosure of every document tied to the trust, including the ones she thought were still hidden. And that hearing was set to take place in just 18 days. 4 nights after the meeting at the law firm, at exactly 1:26 a.m., I sat alone in my parked car outside the Whitmore estate and watched the lights inside the house shut off one by one until only Margaret Whitmore's office window remained illuminated. And at 1:32 a.m., I saw her silhouette pacing slowly back and forth, holding a phone to her ear, while a single sentence from our last meeting echoed in my mind. "Challenging a family with resources is exhausting." If you've ever reached the moment when you realize your strongest move is not to react, but to become completely still, you know how dangerous silence can be. Let me ask you this. Would you keep fighting loudly once the truth starts surfacing? Or would you step back and let your opponent reveal themselves? Because I chose silence, not surrender, not retreat, silence. And that decision shifted the entire balance of power. After the confrontation at the law firm, something inside the Whitmore family fractured in a way that couldn't be repaired. Daniel had moved into a temporary apartment downtown. He hadn't contacted me once in 4 days. No apologies, no explanations. Only one short text sent the morning after the meeting. "I didn't know, I swear." I never responded, because his knowledge no longer mattered. What mattered was his position, and that position had changed dramatically. Margaret's emergency petition against him was still active. The internal audit was now officially underway, and the probate court hearing scheduled in 18 days meant something unavoidable. The family's financial secrets were about to become public record. Margaret Whitmore had built her power on control. But public exposure was the one variable she couldn't contain. That's why she had stopped contacting me entirely. No threats, no offers, no negotiations, just silence. And that silence told me something critical. She was recalculating. I knew her pattern now. When she couldn't control people, she controlled timing. And she would strike only when she believed the outcome was certain, which meant the next move wouldn't be emotional. It would be strategic, calculated, quiet. That's why I spent those 4 days doing exactly one thing. Preparing, not publicly, not dramatically, just methodically. Claire met with me twice during that time. Each meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. Each conversation focused on documentation, timelines, evidence trails. Because revenge isn't built on anger. It's built on proof. During our second meeting, she told me something that changed my entire understanding of Margaret's endgame. The trust administrator has full authority until a court ruling removes them, Claire explained. I nodded. I know. She shook her head slightly. No, you don't understand what that really means. She slid a legal brief across the table. If Margaret convinces the court that Daniel's actions threaten the trust's stability, she doesn't just disinherit him. Claire paused. She gains permanent control of the entire estate. Permanent. That word settled heavily. Because the Whitmore Legacy Trust wasn't just money. It included land holdings, commercial properties, investment portfolios, and construction contracts totaling over $42 million in managed assets. And Margaret wasn't just trying to protect that power. She was trying to consolidate it forever. But she can't do that while I'm still legally connected, I said slowly. Claire nodded. Exactly. Which meant one simple truth. I wasn't just a scapegoat. I was an obstacle, a legal barrier she needed removed. And since she couldn't force me to sign the separation agreement anymore, she would need a different strategy, one that didn't rely on my cooperation. That realization led to one chilling possibility. If she couldn't remove me legally, she might try to destroy my credibility completely. Because in court, reputation matters. And Margaret understood optics better than anyone. That's why I stayed completely silent publicly. No social media. No public accusations. No emotional reactions. I went to work. I came home. I documented everything. Because the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who thrives on control is refuse to give them anything to manipulate. During those days, I also noticed something else. Daniel was unraveling. Not dramatically, quietly. Claire told me he had stopped attending company meetings, stopped responding to internal communications, and most importantly, he had begun requesting financial records directly from Robert Langford. That detail mattered because it meant he had finally realized something devastating. His mother wasn't protecting him. She was replacing him. And that realization would eventually force him into a position he had never experienced before. Powerlessness. On the 5th night after the law firm meeting, my phone rang at 11:48 p.m. It was Daniel. I stared at the screen for a long time before answering, not because I wanted to hear him, but because I needed to know what stage he was in. Denial, blame, victimhood, or collapse. I answered calmly. Yes. His voice sounded different, not defensive, not controlled, just tired. I know why she targeted you, he said quietly. I didn't respond immediately, because silence makes people reveal more. He continued. There was an incident last year, he said. Something I never told you. A pause. Heavy. Then he said something that shifted everything again. She thinks I can't be trusted because she believes I was planning to expose her first. My chest tightened slightly. Expose her for what? I asked. Another long silence. And then he said the words that confirmed what Claire had hinted at, but never fully explained. For moving trust funds into offshore accounts, without board authorization. The air felt still. Because that wasn't just unethical. That was potentially criminal. And if true, it meant the entire battle wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about legal liability, federal scrutiny, possible investigations. Daniel's voice dropped even lower. She believes you're connected to the only evidence that can prove it. My fingers tightened slightly around the phone. I've never seen anything about offshore accounts, I said calmly. I know, he replied, but she doesn't. A pause. Then he added, One final sentence. She thinks someone gave you access to documents she thought were permanently hidden. I didn't say Claire's name. I didn't say anything at all, because now I understood the full shape of Margaret Whitmore's fear. It wasn't losing money. It wasn't losing control. It was losing secrecy. Because secrets are power, and exposure destroys power faster than any legal ruling. As I ended the call that night, one realization settled completely. Margaret Whitmore wasn't just preparing for a probate court battle. She was preparing for something much bigger. Something that could involve federal investigators, financial crimes, and permanent consequences. What she didn't know yet, what no one in that family knew, was that buried inside the internal audit files, there was one encrypted document. A document neither Claire nor Robert had been able to open. A document labeled only with a date from 8 years ago. The exact year the Whitmore Legacy Trust had been amended to include my name. 12 days before the probate hearing, at exactly 5:42 a.m., I sat in my kitchen, staring at a decrypted file that contained 17 wire transfers, totaling $8.3 million, all routed from the Whitmore Legacy Trust into 3 offshore shell accounts. And at 5:49 a.m., I saw the authorization signature on every single transfer. Margaret Louise Whitmore. If you've ever reached the point where the truth stops feeling shocking and starts feeling inevitable, you know the kind of cold clarity that follows. Let me ask you this: if you uncovered proof that powerful people had been hiding financial crimes for years, would you go straight to authorities? Or would you first make sure they could never deny it publicly? Because I didn't contact anyone. Not yet. I had learned something crucial by now. Margaret Whitmore didn't fear accusations. She feared exposure. And exposure only works when it's undeniable, public, irreversible. That encrypted document had taken Claire's IT consultant almost 36 hours to break open. When he finally called us at 4:11 a.m., his voice carried something close to disbelief. "Whatever this is," he said, "someone went to serious lengths to hide it." He wasn't exaggerating. The file had been layered behind multiple authentication locks, masked under unrelated audit folders, and labeled with a deliberately vague code: Archive-2018-B, which immediately caught my attention, because 2018 was the exact year the Whitmore Legacy Trust had been amended to include my name. When the file finally opened, the timeline became brutally clear. Over a span of 4 years, Margaret had authorized a series of strategic asset reallocations from the trust. Each transfer moved funds into offshore accounts registered under shell corporations in the Cayman Islands and Belize. The stated purpose in the internal notes was simple: liquidity protection. But the pattern revealed something else. The transfers always occurred within weeks of major trust reviews, which meant they were never intended to be discovered. They were designed to quietly siphon assets out of oversight. And the total amount, $8.3 million, represented nearly 20% of the trust's liquid holdings. That wasn't just financial maneuvering. That was concealment, possibly fraud. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen as dawn light slowly filled the kitchen, because one fact now stood undeniable. Margaret Whitmore wasn't just protecting the family's wealth. She had been quietly moving it out of reach for years. And if Daniel ever exposed that, she could face legal consequences far beyond losing control of the trust, which explained everything. Her urgency to discredit him. Her strategy to eliminate any legal obstacles before the probate court reviewed the trust's financial history. She wasn't just fighting for power. She was fighting to avoid accountability. Claire sat across from me at the kitchen table, her expression tight as she read through the documents. "This changes the entire case," she said quietly. I nodded. Yes, because the probate hearing wasn't just about Daniel's beneficiary status anymore. Once this evidence surfaced, the court would have to examine Margaret's conduct as trust administrator, and that could trigger a full forensic audit, which meant federal oversight, which meant consequences she couldn't control. Claire closed the laptop slowly. "There's only one problem," she said. I met her gaze. "What?" She held my eyes steadily. "Right now, this evidence exists only in private copies." That was true. And legally, private possession of documents didn't guarantee admissibility, which meant Margaret still had one possible defense: deny, discredit, delay, unless the exposure happened in a setting she couldn't control, a setting where denial would be impossible. Public, documented, witnessed. I understood immediately. The probate hearing, I said. Claire nodded. Yes, because probate proceedings were public record. Every document submitted, every statement made, every financial disclosure, all permanently accessible. Margaret could influence internal audits. She could pressure company employees. She could manipulate private negotiations. But she couldn't erase public court filings. And she couldn't silence testimony under oath. That realization shifted something inside me. For weeks, I had been reacting, analyzing, surviving. Now, for the first time, I was planning. Not revenge, driven by anger, but exposure, driven by truth. I looked back at the screen. The wire transfer records, the authorization signatures, the internal notes, all of it pointed to a single, undeniable fact. Margaret Whitmore had been using the trust as her personal financial shield. And if that shield collapsed, so would her power. But there was still one critical question. Why had she added my name to the trust 8 years ago? Because nothing about her behavior suggested she ever intended me to benefit from it, which meant my inclusion wasn't generosity. It was strategy. I opened the earliest document in the archive folder, the trust amendment dated 8 years earlier. My name appeared under a section labeled Contingent Beneficiary for Asset Continuity Protection. Below it, a handwritten note scanned into the file read, Required for legal diversification compliance, low-risk external party. I stared at that line for a long time. Low-risk external party. That was how she had seen me. Not as family. Not even as a threat. Just a legal placeholder. Someone outside the Whitmore power structure. Someone unlikely to question anything. Someone easy to control or discard. Until now. Claire broke the silence quietly. There's something else you need to prepare for. I looked at her. What? Her expression was serious. When this evidence surfaces, Margaret won't just deny it. She paused. She'll attack your credibility. I already knew that. It was predictable. But Claire continued, and she'll claim you accessed these documents illegally. That mattered. Because if she successfully framed me as someone who stole confidential records, the court could dismiss my testimony. The evidence could be challenged, and Margaret could regain control of the narrative. I exhaled slowly. So we need a witness, I said. Claire nodded. More than one. Because truth alone isn't enough in legal battles. It needs validation, corroboration, and timing. Everything now depended on one final element. Who would step forward publicly to confirm what these documents revealed? Robert Langford could testify about internal approvals. Claire could confirm legal inconsistencies. But there was still a missing piece. Someone who had direct knowledge of the offshore accounts. Someone inside Margaret's inner circle. Someone she trusted completely. And according to the last internal email timestamp in the archive folder, that person had already sent a message requesting a meeting. The sender's name appeared at the bottom of the screen, a name that made my stomach tighten instantly. Because it wasn't an employee. It wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't a business partner. It was Margaret Whitmore's younger sister. The one person in the family who had never attended any of the recent meetings. The one person who had remained completely silent. Until now. 9 days before the probate hearing, at exactly 3:18 p.m., I walked into a quiet hotel lounge on the edge of Lake Travis and saw Margaret Whitmore's younger sister sitting alone at a corner table with a sealed envelope placed directly in front of her. And at 3:21 p.m., before I could even sit down, she looked at me calmly and said, "My sister thinks she's untouchable, but she made one mistake 8 years ago when she decided to use your name. If you've ever met someone who has lived for years inside the shadow of a powerful family secret, you know how heavy the silence around them feels. Let me ask you this. Would you trust someone who suddenly steps forward after staying quiet for so long? Or would you wonder what finally pushed them to speak?" Because I didn't answer her right away, I studied her first. Her name was Lorraine Whitmore Kent, 58 years old, former board member of the Whitmore Family Foundation, and the only sibling Margaret had ever publicly disagreed with. Though no one in the family ever explained why, she looked nothing like Margaret. Where Margaret was rigid and polished, Lorraine's presence was quieter, softer, but her eyes carried something unmistakable: weariness and resolve. She gestured toward the chair across from her. "You should sit," she said gently. A tone held none of the sharpness I had come to associate with the Whitmore name. I sat down slowly. The envelope remained between us on the table, unopened, heavy with implication. For a moment, neither of us spoke, because some conversations begin not with words, but with shared understanding. Finally, Lorraine exhaled quietly. "I should have stepped forward years ago," she said. Her voice carried regret, but also something else: relief. "Why didn't you?" I asked calmly. She held my gaze. "Because I believed Margaret would eventually stop." A pause. "She never does." That statement wasn't emotional. It was factual. A conclusion drawn from decades of experience. Lorraine placed her hand lightly on the envelope. "Everything you've discovered so far," she said, "is only part of the story." My pulse remained steady, because by now, I expected nothing less. She slid the envelope toward me. "You need to understand why she chose you specifically." I opened it carefully. Inside were photocopies of older trust records, documents dated more than a decade earlier, before I had ever met Daniel, before I had even moved to Texas. At the top of the first page was a title: Original Asset Diversification Plan. The document outlined a legal requirement triggered after a federal compliance review of the Whitmore Legacy Trust. It stated that due to the trust's concentrated control within a single-family lineage, it needed to designate an external beneficiary to maintain regulatory compliance. Without one, the trust risked increased scrutiny from financial oversight agencies. My name appeared on the final page, handwritten beside a typed line: Selected External Beneficiary Candidate. My breath caught slightly, because that meant something chilling. I hadn't been chosen randomly. I had been selected. I looked up at Lorraine. "How did she even know who I was?" I asked. Lorraine's expression tightened. "Because she had been tracking Daniel's relationships for years," she said quietly. The words landed heavily. "She believed he would eventually marry someone outside the family's influence," Lorraine continued. "So she prepared in advance. Prepared years in advance." The realization settled like ice in my chest. Margaret hadn't just reacted to my presence in her son's life. She had anticipated it, planned for it, used it. Lorraine leaned forward slightly. "When Daniel introduced you to the family," she said, "Margaret saw an opportunity." Her eyes held mine steadily. "You were financially independent, had no family ties in Texas, and no legal history that could complicate trust compliance. Low-risk, external party." The phrase from the trust amendment echoed again, except now it felt even colder, because it meant my entire relationship with that family had been shaped by a legal strategy I never knew existed. "You weren't chosen because she liked you," Lorraine said softly. "You were chosen because she believed you would never challenge her." A quiet silence followed, because there was no anger left in me, only clarity. I looked back down at the documents. One detail stood out immediately: a handwritten note from Margaret, dated 8 years earlier. If necessary, beneficiary can be removed through marital dissolution prior to asset activation. My fingers tightened slightly on the paper. She had planned my erasure before my marriage even began. Lorraine watched my reaction carefully. "She always believed she could control every variable," she said. I met her gaze. "So why are you telling me this now?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Because she crossed a line this time." A pause. Then she said something that shifted everything once again. "The offshore accounts weren't just about protecting assets." My attention sharpened instantly. "What do you mean?" Lorraine's voice lowered. "They were about hiding a financial loss she never disclosed." A cold tension spread through my chest. "How much?" I asked. Lorraine didn't blink. "Nearly $11 million. The number settled heavily in the air, because that wasn't a minor discrepancy. That was catastrophic. "She made high-risk investments through private channels 5 years ago," Lorraine continued. "When those investments failed, she quietly moved funds from the trust to cover the losses." My mind connected the timeline immediately. The offshore transfers, the concealed authorizations, the escalating urgency to maintain control. All of it suddenly made sense. Margaret wasn't just protecting power. She was covering a financial collapse. "And if that becomes public," I said slowly. Lorraine nodded. "She loses everything. Not just authority over the trust, but credibility. Reputation. Possibly legal protection, because misuse of fiduciary authority carries serious consequences. She leaned back slightly. That's why she can't afford the probate hearing to expose the trust's financial history. Her eyes held mine. And that's why she will do anything to stop it. Anything. That word hung between us. Heavy. Unsettling. Because I knew what it meant. Margaret Whitmore was cornered. And people who are cornered don't become reasonable. They become desperate. I carefully returned the documents to the envelope. "Will you testify?" I asked quietly. Lorraine didn't hesitate. Yes, that single word shifted the balance completely. Because now, Margaret no longer faced isolated accusations. She faced family testimony, under oath, publicly, irreversibly. But Lorraine added one final sentence. Soft. Grave. "There's something else you need to know." I looked at her. "What?" Her expression darkened slightly. "Margaret believes you already have evidence tying her directly to the missing 11 million. My chest tightened. "I don't," I said. Lorraine nodded slowly. "I know." A pause. Then she said the words that sent a cold ripple through me. "But she doesn't," which meant one unavoidable reality. Margaret Whitmore now believed I held the final piece capable of destroying her completely. And when someone believes that, they stop trying to manipulate outcomes. They start trying to eliminate threats. As I left the hotel that afternoon, one realization settled heavily in my mind. The probate hearing was no longer just a legal battle. It had become a countdown. Because Margaret Whitmore was running out of time. And when she ran out of options, no one could predict what she might do next. 3 days before the probate hearing, at exactly 7:05 p.m., Margaret Whitmore stood at the front of a crowded ballroom during her Family Foundation's annual charity gala and announced, "Tonight, we celebrate transparency and legacy." And at 7:11 p.m., while 214 guests applauded and cameras flashed, she publicly accused me, by name, of attempting to steal confidential financial records from the Whitmore Trust. If you've ever been blindsided in a public setting by someone trying to control the narrative before the truth can surface, you know how disorienting that moment feels. Let me ask you this. If someone tried to destroy your credibility in front of hundreds of influential witnesses, would you react immediately? Or would you let them speak long enough to expose their own desperation? Because I didn't interrupt her. I didn't defend myself. I didn't move. I stood perfectly still near the back of the ballroom, exactly where I had planned to be. The gala was held at the Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Austin, a high-profile annual event attended by business leaders, local politicians, and media representatives connected to the Whitmore Foundation. Margaret had chosen this setting deliberately. Public, influential, sympathetic. A room full of people who had trusted her reputation for decades, and she was using that platform to strike first. Classic strategy. Control the story before evidence appears. Her voice carried smoothly across the room through the microphone. "In recent weeks," she continued calmly, "our family has faced internal challenges related to confidential trust records." She paused just long enough for attention to sharpen. "Unfortunately, one individual has attempted to access and misuse private financial information for personal gain." Then she said my name. "Mrs. Elena Marquez Whitmore." A wave of murmurs moved through the audience. I felt dozens of eyes turned toward me, but I didn't react. Because this moment wasn't unexpected. Claire had warned me this was likely. Margaret needed to attack my credibility before the court hearing, to frame me as untrustworthy, manipulative, possibly criminal, so that when evidence surfaced later, people would question its legitimacy. Margaret continued speaking with controlled authority. "We are cooperating fully with internal reviews and will take all necessary steps to protect the integrity of our family legacy." Integrity. The word echoed with bitter irony. She stepped away from the podium briefly, then added, in a softer tone, designed to sound sympathetic, "Sometimes people we try to help misunderstand generosity." That line was carefully crafted. It painted me as an outsider, ungrateful, opportunistic, exactly the narrative she had built for years. For a moment, the room remained silent, waiting, watching, expecting me to react emotionally, to defend myself, to confirm her portrayal. But I didn't move. Because silence is powerful when someone else is already revealing too much. Then, something shifted. From the left side of the ballroom, a new voice spoke clearly. "That's not accurate." Every head turned. Claire Whitmore Hastings stepped forward from the crowd, her posture calm, her voice steady. "I am an attorney," she said into the microphone a staff member instinctively handed her, "and I have personally reviewed the financial records in question." Margaret's expression tightened for the first time that evening. Claire continued, "There is no evidence that Elena Marquez accessed or misused trust documents illegally." A ripple of tension moved through the room. Margaret stepped back toward the podium quickly. "This is not the time for internal disputes," she said sharply. But Claire didn't step back. Instead, she said the sentence that shifted the entire atmosphere. "The probate court hearing scheduled this week will address the matter publicly." The word publicly landed heavily, because now the audience understood something important. This wasn't a private family disagreement. It was a legal issue, a formal proceeding, one that would soon become public record. Margaret's calm mask began to crack. She spoke again, her tone sharper. "This is an internal administrative review." Claire shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "It's a fiduciary investigation." That phrase changed everything, because fiduciary investigations involve legal accountability, financial oversight, potential legal consequences. Whispers spread across the ballroom. Phones appeared discreetly in guests' hands. Messages already being sent. The narrative was slipping beyond Margaret's control. That's when Lorraine Whitmore Kent stepped forward. The room fell completely silent. Because she hadn't attended a Whitmore event in nearly 5 years, her presence alone carried significance. She walked calmly to the front, then spoke clearly. "As a former board member of the Whitmore Foundation, I can confirm that the trust administrator authorized offshore transfers totaling over $8 million. The words landed like a controlled explosion. Gasps rippled through the room. Margaret's face went pale for the first time. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped. The denial stage. Predictable. Lorraine didn't react emotionally. She simply held up a folder. "These are certified copies of transfer authorizations, signed by you." Silence fell heavily, because evidence had entered the conversation. Publicly, irreversibly, Margaret's voice rose. "This is a misunderstanding of complex asset protection strategies. Blame shifting." Second stage, exactly as expected. But then Daniel stepped forward from the edge of the room. His voice cut through the tension. "No," he said quietly, "it isn't." Every eye turned toward him. His face looked exhausted, but resolute. "I reviewed the records personally," he continued, "and none of these transfers were disclosed to the Trust Oversight Board." That statement carried enormous legal weight. Because non-disclosure by a fiduciary can constitute breach of duty, Margaret's composure finally fractured. "You're being manipulated," she said sharply. Victim framing. Third stage, her final defense. But Daniel didn't back down. He said the sentence that ended her control of the narrative completely. "I trusted you," he said quietly, "and you used that trust to hide losses you caused." The room fell into stunned silence, because now the truth had emerged from within her own family. Not from outsiders, not from accusations, from witnesses, from insiders, from those she had once controlled. Margaret stood frozen at the podium, her authority dissolving in real time. And for the first time since this entire conflict began, she looked genuinely afraid, not of losing money, not of losing reputation, but of something far more dangerous. Exposure under oath. Because what happened at the gala was only the beginning. Everything revealed that night would now be documented, investigated, verified, and presented at the probate hearing just 3 days later. But as I stood quietly at the back of the ballroom, watching her power collapse piece by piece, one realization settled heavily in my mind. Margaret Whitmore wasn't finished yet, because people who have built their entire lives on control don't surrender easily. And according to a message Claire received just minutes after the gala ended, Margaret had already filed an emergency legal motion overnight. A motion that, if approved before the hearing began, could temporarily block all financial records from being presented in court. On the morning of the probate hearing, at exactly 8:02 a.m., I walked into the Travis County Courthouse, carrying a single legal binder that contained 312 pages of financial records and an emergency court notice stating Margaret Whitmore had filed a motion to block all trust documents from being admitted into evidence. And at 8:17 a.m., when the judge entered the courtroom, her attorney stood up and calmly announced, "We request an immediate protective order to prevent further reputational harm caused by unauthorized disclosure." If you've ever watched someone try to use legal procedure not to prove innocence, but to delay the truth, you know how tense that kind of silence feels. Let me ask you this. If you knew the evidence was real, but risked being excluded on a technicality, would you panic? Or would you trust preparation to do its work? Because I didn't panic. I didn't speak. I simply waited. The probate courtroom was smaller than I expected. Rows of wooden benches, neutral walls. A quiet, controlled atmosphere that made every sound feel amplified. Margaret sat at the petitioner's table in a tailored gray suit, her posture rigid, her expression composed once again. She looked almost restored, as if the gala confrontation had never happened. That alone told me how dangerous she remained. Because she wasn't emotional, she was strategic. Her attorney, William Harland, a senior partner from the same firm managing the trust, stood confidently before the judge. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "private trust records have been improperly accessed and publicly mischaracterized. We seek an immediate order restricting further use of these documents." He paused deliberately, "until their authenticity and chain of custody can be verified." That phrase mattered. Chain of custody. Because if the court questioned how the documents were obtained, they could be excluded. Margaret's entire strategy hinged on that technicality. Discredit the evidence. Delay review. Regain control. I sat quietly at the respondent's table beside Claire. Daniel sat 2 seats away. He hadn't spoken to me that morning, but his presence alone signaled something important. He was no longer aligned with his mother. He was aligned with the truth. The judge, a calm woman in her early 60s, looked down at the filings. "Do the respondents have representation?" she asked. Claire stood immediately. "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice remained steady. "We oppose the motion." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Claire stepped forward. "Your Honor, the petitioner's request attempts to prevent the court from reviewing fiduciary conduct directly relevant to this proceeding." She placed a separate binder on the evidence table. "These records were obtained through internal audit disclosures and certified corporate documentation." She paused. "And we have witnesses prepared to verify their authenticity." That last sentence shifted the atmosphere. Because evidence alone can be challenged, but witnesses under oath cannot be dismissed easily. Harland responded quickly. "The origin of these documents remains unclear," he argued. "Unauthorized copying of private financial records raises serious legal concerns." Margaret sat still beside him, her eyes fixed forward. But I noticed something subtle. Her hands were clasped tightly. For the first time, tension showed, because she knew something her attorney did not. She knew who the witnesses would be. The judge looked at Claire again. "Who will testify regarding the records?" she asked. Claire answered clearly. "The chief financial officer of Whitmore Construction Group and a former board member of the Whitmore Foundation." A ripple of movement spread quietly through the courtroom. Margaret's attorney hesitated. Because those weren't external sources. They were internal, trusted, legitimate. Robert Langford was called first. He stepped to the witness stand, his voice calm but firm, as he confirmed the internal audit findings. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "These transfer authorizations bear Margaret Whitmore's verified electronic signature." Harlan attempted to challenge him. "Mr. Langford, could these have been routine asset protection measures?" Robert shook his head. "No," he replied. "They were not disclosed to the Trust Oversight Board, which violates fiduciary protocol." The word "violates" hung heavily, because now the issue wasn't interpretation, it was breach. Lorraine testified next. Her voice remained steady as she confirmed the existence of undisclosed investment losses. "The offshore transfers coincided with failed private investments," she said, "and those losses were never reported to beneficiaries." The courtroom fell silent, because this testimony established something crucial: motive, concealment, intent. Margaret's composure began to crack again. She leaned toward her attorney, whispering urgently. He rose once more. "Your Honor," he said, "even if these transactions occurred, they were executed to protect trust stability." Blame shifting. Justification. Exactly as expected. But then, something unexpected happened. Daniel stood. His voice was quiet but clear. Your Honor, I request permission to address the court. The judge considered briefly, then nodded. Proceed. Daniel stepped forward slowly. His face looked tired but determined. I was the primary beneficiary of the Whitmore Trust, he said, and I was never informed of these transfers. He paused. I trusted the administrator completely. Then he said the sentence that shifted everything irreversibly, and that trust was exploited to conceal financial losses. The word exploited echoed heavily because it wasn't emotional. It was factual, legal, precise. Margaret's attorney lowered his gaze slightly. He understood now. The protective motion could no longer succeed. Too many internal witnesses, too much corroboration. The judge spoke calmly. The motion to restrict financial records is denied. Her gavel struck once. Firm. Final. Full documentation will be admitted into the probate review. A quiet wave of tension released across the courtroom. Margaret sat motionless. Her control had collapsed completely, not through accusations, but through process, through evidence, through witnesses she could no longer silence. For the first time since this began, she looked directly at me. Her eyes held something new, not anger, not superiority, fear. Because she understood something now. The legal consequences were no longer hypothetical. They were inevitable. As the hearing adjourned for recess, Claire leaned toward me quietly. It's over, she whispered, but I didn't feel relief. Because one final truth remained unresolved. The trust itself. Who would control it after the court's ruling? Because exposure alone doesn't determine outcomes. Legal authority does. And as we prepared to return for the final session that afternoon, a court clerk handed Claire a sealed notice. Her expression shifted slightly as she read it. She looked at me and said quietly, "There's been an emergency amendment filed overnight." My chest tightened. By Margaret? I asked. Claire shook her head slowly. No. She paused. It was filed by the trust's original founder, a name I had never seen before. A name tied to the creation of the Whitmore Legacy Trust decades earlier. And according to the notice, that amendment changed the entire beneficiary structure of the trust, effective immediately. At 4:36 p.m. that afternoon, when the probate court reconvened, the judge opened a newly submitted amendment to the Whitmore Legacy Trust, one signed by its original founder and notarized less than 12 hours earlier. And at 4:41 p.m., she read aloud a single sentence that ended Margaret Whitmore's authority completely. Effective immediately, the current administrator is removed for breach of fiduciary duty, and full control transfers to the designated continuity beneficiary. If you've ever waited through a long, quiet storm, knowing the outcome will finally arrive in a single moment, you know how still the world feels just before it happens. Let me ask you this. When justice finally comes, do you imagine it as loud and dramatic, or quiet and undeniable? Because what happened next was not dramatic. It was calm, final, irreversible. The courtroom fell completely silent as the judge continued reading. The continuity beneficiary, designated under the 2018 Amendment for Asset Preservation Compliance, is Elena Sofia Marquez. My full legal name echoed through the room, clear, precise, unavoidable. For a moment, I didn't move. I didn't react. Because the weight of that moment wasn't about money. It was about something far deeper. Recognition. Restoration. Truth acknowledged publicly. Across the room, Margaret Whitmore's face drained of all color. Her hands trembled visibly for the first time since I had ever known her. She whispered something urgently to her attorney, but he didn't respond. Because there was nothing left to argue. The amendment had been filed legally by the trust's original founder Margaret's own father, Harold Whitmore, now 91 years old and living under medical guardianship in Arizona. A clause buried in the original trust documents allowed him to intervene directly if fiduciary misconduct threatened the estate's integrity. And someone had ensured he finally saw the evidence. Claire had suspected that possibility, but none of us knew whether it would happen. Until now. The judge spoke again. This amendment also mandates an independent forensic audit of all trust financial activity over the past 10 years. A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom because that meant something unavoidable. Full transparency, federal oversight, permanent documentation. Margaret's authority was gone, her reputation irreparably damaged, and her legal exposure only beginning. She stood slowly, her voice unsteady for the first time. "This is an overreaction," she said. But no one responded. No one defended her. Not Daniel, not her attorney, not even the remaining family members seated behind her, because the final stage had arrived. Collapse. Complete. Silent. The judge closed the file. This court recognizes Elena Sofia Marquez as the acting administrator of the Whitmore Legacy Trust, effective immediately. Her gavel struck once. Firm. Decisive. And just like that, the battle ended. Not with shouting, not with confrontation, but with documentation. Process. Truth revealed step by step until denial became impossible. After the hearing, the courthouse hallway felt strangely quiet. People moved respectfully around me, not staring, not whispering, just acknowledging. Because public exposure changes how people see everything. Daniel approached me slowly. His expression carried something I had never seen before. Humility. "I never understood how strong you were," he said quietly. I held his gaze calmly. "This wasn't about strength," I replied. "It was about refusing to disappear." He nodded. Tears filled his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The words hung between us, heavy, but no longer powerful, because apologies don't restore trust. They only acknowledge its loss. I didn't say I forgave him. I didn't say I hated him. I simply said the truth. You chose silence when it mattered most. He lowered his head, and that was the end of that conversation. Later that evening, as the sun set over Austin, I returned alone to the small apartment I had rented months earlier. The city lights glowed softly through the window, calm, unchanged. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked at the final court notice one last time. Not the financial figures, not the legal language, just one line near the bottom. Administrator duties require transparency, accountability, and fiduciary care for all beneficiaries. That sentence felt symbolic because it represented everything Margaret had failed to uphold, and everything I now had the responsibility to protect. A few weeks later, the independent audit confirmed what the evidence had already shown. Margaret Whitmore had concealed millions in losses through unauthorized transfers. She resigned from all foundation positions shortly after. No public statements, no press conferences, just quiet disappearance from the world she once controlled. The trust assets remained intact under new oversight. Daniel chose not to contest the restructuring. Instead, he accepted a reduced beneficiary status under the revised compliance plan. A humbler role. One that required transparency. For me, life did not transform dramatically. I kept my job at the hospital for several months because stability mattered more than status. Because identity isn't built on inheritance. It's built on choices. Eventually, I transitioned into a new role, managing trust compliance programs to ensure other beneficiaries never faced what I had. Not revenge. Responsibility. Sometimes justice doesn't look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like quiet boundaries, clear lines, and peace that comes from knowing the truth can no longer be hidden. One evening, months later, I stood by the lake watching the water reflect the fading sunlight. The air was calm, still, and for the first time in years, I felt something simple. Not victory, not relief, just quiet certainty. I had not been erased. I had not been silenced. And I had learned something that stays true in every story like this. Power built on secrets always collapses when exposed to light. Before we close this story, tell me in the comments if you were in Elena's position. Would you have walked away quietly at the beginning? Or stayed to uncover the truth, no matter how long it took? And if you want to hear another story about betrayal, hidden inheritance, and the moment karma finally arrives, stay with me for the next one.